The California sun was setting over the coastal highway, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. It was the summer of 1973, and Clint Eastwood had just wrapped up filming High Plains Drifter, a western that had pushed him to his limits both physically and mentally. After weeks of intense shooting in the dusty heat, he needed some time alone with his thoughts. Eastwood drove his old pickup truck along the winding roads near Big Sur. The radio played softly, some Johnny Cash tune about a man who'd been everywhere. Eastwood tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, enjoying the simple pleasure of being anonymous for a while. No cameras, no crew, no one asking for autographs. Just a man and the open road. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since breakfast. Up ahead, a neon sign flickered to life as dusk settled in. Pete's Roadside Diner, it announced in electric blue. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a row of motorcycles lined up near the entrance, big gleaming machines with high handlebars and custom paintwork. Eastwood pulled into the gravel lot, parking his truck away from the bikes. He sat for a moment, considering whether to find another place to eat. He wasn't looking for trouble, and bikers could sometimes bring it. But he was hungry, and the smell of burgers and fries wafting from the diner was too tempting to resist. What the hell? He muttered to himself, climbing out of the truck. He was wearing faded jeans, worn boots, and a simple blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Nothing that screamed movie star. His face was tanned from weeks of outdoor shooting, and his eyes had that squint that came from staring into the California sun. With his hat pulled low, he hoped to blend in like any other traveler passing through. The bell above the door jingled as Eastwood stepped inside. The diner had that classic American feel, red vinyl booths, a long counter with spinning stools, and the smell of coffee and grease hanging in the air. A waitress in her 50s with dyed red hair and bright lipstick was refilling coffee cups. In the corner booth, 6 bikers were making most of the noise in the place. They were a rough-looking bunch, leather vests covered in patches, bandanas, beards, and tattoos. They laughed loudly, swearing and telling stories that carried across the small diner. The few other customers, an elderly couple and a truck driver, kept their eyes down, clearly uncomfortable with the rowdy group. Eastwood chose a corner booth far from the bikers. He sat with his back to the wall, an old habit that gave him a view of the entire diner. The waitress approached, notepad in hand. "Evening, hun. What can I get ya?" she asked, her voice raspy from years of cigarettes. "Coffee, black, and whatever burger special you've got," Eastwood replied, keeping his voice low. The waitress, her name tag read Dottie, squinted at him for a second. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, but she just nodded and moved on. Eastwood appreciated her discretion. As he waited for his food, Eastwood pulled out a small notebook from his back pocket. He'd been jotting down ideas for a film he wanted to direct. Something different from the westerns and cop movies he'd become known for. He became absorbed in his notes, the noise of the diner fading into the background. The sound of breaking glass pulled him from his thoughts. One of the bikers had knocked over a beer bottle, sending it shattering across the floor. The group roared with laughter as Dottie hurried over with a broom, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Don't worry about it, sweetheart," said the biggest of the bikers, a mountain of a man with a wild beard and arms covered in faded tattoos. "We'll make it worth your while." He slapped a 20 on the table, but his tone made it sound more like an insult than a tip. Eastwood watched the scene play out, his face impassive. He'd encountered men like this before, both in real life and in the characters he portrayed. Men who confused intimidation with strength. He returned to his notebook but kept one ear tuned to the biker's table. His food arrived, a burger that looked homemade, piled high with toppings and a side of crispy fries. Eastwood nodded his thanks to Dottie and began to eat. The burger was good, made with care in the small kitchen. He ate slowly, savoring the simple meal. At the biker's table, the conversation had turned to movies. Eastwood couldn't help but listen as his name came up. "Man, did you see that new Dirty Harry flick?" One of them asked, a younger guy with a patchy beard. "Eastwood is one cold son of a gun in that one." "All talk," said another. a skinny man with greasy blonde hair hanging past his shoulders. Those Hollywood types ain't half as tough as they look on screen. Put 'em in a real fight, they'd run crying to their trailers. Eastwood almost smiled. If they only knew about the hours he spent training in a dojo in Oakland. The black belt in Kyokushin karate he'd earned through years of discipline and practice. The techniques he'd mastered that had nothing to do with movie stunts or camera tricks. Real fighting wasn't about looking tough or talking big. It was about control, focus, and knowing when to act. But Eastwood wasn't there to prove anything. He continued eating his burger, flipping through his notebook between bites. The diner had quieted down a bit as the elderly couple paid their bill and left. The truck driver followed soon after, leaving just Eastwood, the bikers, Dottie, and the cook somewhere in the back. The bell above the door jingled again as a young couple walked in. They took one look at the bikers, exchanged a glance, and promptly turned around to leave. The big bearded biker called after them. "Hey, don't go. We don't bite much." The group erupted in laughter again as the door closed behind the retreating couple. "You boys mind keeping it down a bit?" Dottie asked, her patience clearly wearing thin. "You're scaring away my customers." "Aw, we're just having some fun," said the bearded one, clearly the leader of the group. "Besides, you still got him." He nodded toward Eastwood's corner, and, just like that, all eyes were on him. Eastwood looked up from his notebook, his expression neutral. He nodded slightly, then went back to his writing, hoping they'd lose interest. They didn't. "Hey, buddy, you look familiar," called one of the bikers, a stocky guy with a shaved head. "You from around here?" Eastwood shook his head without looking up. "Just passing through." The bikers exchanged looks. The bearded leader squinted, studying Eastwood's profile. Realization dawned on his face, followed by a wide grin that revealed a missing tooth. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, rising from his seat. "Boys, we got ourselves a celebrity." The other bikers turned to look more carefully at Eastwood. One by one, their expressions changed as they recognized him. "Holy shit, it's Dirty Harry." "Nah, man, that's the man with no name. It's Clint freaking Eastwood." Eastwood sighed internally. So much for a quiet meal. He closed his notebook and slipped it back into his pocket. He'd dealt with fans before, sometimes respectful, sometimes not. These guys didn't look like the respectful type. The bearded leader sauntered over to Eastwood's table, his boots heavy on the linoleum floor. He stood there for a moment, arms crossed over his massive chest, looking down at Eastwood. Well, the tough guy himself," he said, his voice carrying a challenge. "You know, I always wondered if you're as hard as you seem in them movies." Dottie appeared suddenly, coffee pot in hand. "More coffee, sir?" she asked Eastwood, purposely putting herself between him and the biker. "He's fine," the biker said, waving her away. "Me and Mr. Movie Star here are just getting acquainted." Eastwood met the man's gaze evenly. "I'm just trying to enjoy a quiet meal," he said, his voice low and measured. "No trouble." The biker grinned. "Who said anything about trouble? We're just big fans, ain't we, boys?" The others had gathered behind their leader, forming a semicircle around Eastwood's booth. "We just want to know, is Dirty Harry as tough in real life as he is on the big screen?" Eastwood didn't answer right away. He reached for his coffee cup, taking a slow sip. The diner had gone completely silent. Even Dottie was frozen behind the counter, the coffee pot still in her hand. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. What none of the bikers knew, what very few people knew, was that beneath Eastwood's calm exterior was a disciplined martial artist. For years between film projects, he had trained rigorously in karate. It wasn't something he advertised or talked about in interviews. He didn't do it for publicity or to enhance his tough guy image. He did it for himself, for the focus it required, the discipline it taught, and the calm it brought to his mind. As the bikers loomed over him, waiting for his response, Eastwood felt no fear, only a slight annoyance at having his solitude interrupted. He knew he could handle himself if things got physical, but he also knew that the best fights were the ones you avoided. The bearded biker was still waiting for an answer, his patience visibly thinning. The air in the small diner crackled with Tension as the sun finally disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving the neon lights to cast their blue glow over the scene. The bearded biker planted his hands on Eastwood's table, leaning forward until his face was uncomfortably close. His breath smelled of beer and cigarettes. Behind him, his 5 companions formed a wall of leather and denim, effectively cutting off any easy exit. "You seem mighty quiet for a big shot," the biker said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just not so tough without a script." Eastwood set down his coffee cup carefully. He'd faced down plenty of men like this before, men who mistook aggression for strength, who thought intimidation was the same as power. He'd played characters who would have reached for a gun or thrown a punch by now. But the real Clint Eastwood wasn't Dirty Harry or the man with no name. He was something else entirely. "I'm just trying to have dinner," Eastwood said evenly, his voice low but clear. "And you boys are disturbing my meal." A chorus of mocking oohs came from the bikers. The leader's face split into a wide grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Here, that boys, we're disturbing the movie star's dinner." He straightened up, crossing tattooed arms over his chest. "Well, excuse us all to hell." From behind the counter, Dottie's worried voice cut through the tension. "Listen, fellas, I don't want any trouble in my place. Why don't I get you all around on the house back at your own table?" The skinny biker with the long blonde hair laughed. "Lady, we're just having a friendly chat with a celebrity. Nothing wrong with that, is there?" Eastwood caught Dottie's eye and gave her a small nod, telling her without words that it was okay. She hesitated, then stepped back, still clutching the coffee pot like it might be a weapon if needed. The bearded leader pulled up a chair from a nearby table, spinning it around and straddling it backward, his arms resting on the backrest as he faced Eastwood. It was a deliberate invasion of space, a power move meant to unsettle. His buddies dragged over more chairs surrounding Eastwood's booth. "So, tell us," the leader said, mock curiosity in his voice. "How much of that tough guy stuff is real? You ever actually fired a gun outside of a movie set? You ever been in a real fight?" Eastwood remained still, his face giving away nothing. Years of martial arts training had taught him more than just how to fight. It had taught him when not. 2. The first principle of Kyokushin karate wasn't about striking techniques or footwork. It was about self-control, about knowing that true strength came from restraint. "I've had my share of scrapes," Eastwood replied, his tone conversational despite the hostile atmosphere. "Nothing worth writing home about." The bald biker snorted. "Yeah, right. Bet the only punches you've thrown were choreographed." Eastwood shrugged, taking another bite of his burger. His apparent lack of concern seemed to irritate the bikers more than any show of anger would have. The leader leaned closer. "You know, my cousin was an extra in one of your westerns. Said you were a real pain in the ass on set. Said you acted like you owned the place." This was a lie, and Eastwood knew it. He was known in Hollywood for running efficient, professional sets, for treating crew with respect. But he recognized the tactic. The biker was trying to provoke him, looking for a reaction. "Everyone's entitled to their opinion," Eastwood said mildly, taking another sip of coffee. A flash of irritation crossed the leader's face. This wasn't going how he'd planned. The famous tough guy wasn't rising to the bait, wasn't showing fear, wasn't showing much of anything. "You know what I think," the leader said, his voice hardening. "I think you're all talk. I think without your directors and your stunt doubles and your special effects, you're nothing but a skinny old man playing pretend." The other bikers chuckled, feeding off their leader's growing hostility. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted from tense to dangerous. Outside, the neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting strange shadows through the windows. Eastwood sat down, his fork, and wiped his mouth with a napkin. He looked directly at the biker leader for the first time, his gaze steady. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, forcing the others to lean in to hear him. "Maybe you're right," he said. "Maybe it's all an act. Why don't you go back to your table, enjoy your evening, and we can all just call it a night?" It was a peace offering, a chance for everyone to walk away with dignity and tact. But the biker leader wasn't interested in peace. He'd started something in front of his crew, and now he had to finish it or lose face. "What if I don't want to go back to my table?" he challenged, shoving Eastwood's plate to the side. What if I decide I want yours instead? Eastwood didn't answer immediately. He glanced around the diner, at Dottie's worried face, at the cook, who had emerged from the kitchen holding a large metal spatula like a weapon, at the 5 bikers surrounding their leader. He'd hoped to avoid this, but it was becoming clear that these men weren't going to back down without some kind of confrontation. Look, Eastwood said finally, I don't want any trouble. I've got no quarrel with you or your friends. Well, that's too bad, the leader replied, because we've got a quarrel with you. All you Hollywood types looking down on regular folks making millions while the rest of us struggle. His voice had taken on a performative quality, as if he were giving a speech for his audience of fellow bikers. Eastwood almost smiled at the irony. His own father had been a steelworker, and he'd done his share of hard labor jobs before breaking into acting. But this wasn't about his background or who he really was. The biker had created a version of Clint Eastwood in his mind, and that was who he was confronting. I'm sorry you feel that way, Eastwood said. But I'm just a guy trying to eat dinner. The leader's patience finally snapped. With a sudden movement, he knocked Eastwood's coffee cup off the table. It shattered on the floor, hot coffee splashing everywhere. Oops, the biker said with mock innocence. Guess you're done with dinner now. For the first time, something changed in Eastwood's eyes. Not fear, not even anger exactly. Just a kind of decision being made. He straightened slightly in his seat, his hands resting lightly on the table. To most observers, he would have looked relaxed, but a trained fighter would have recognized the subtle shift in his posture, the way he was balancing his weight, preparing. Dottie rushed over with a rag. Now that's enough, she said, her earlier timidity replaced by indignation. I want you boys out of my diner right now. The biker leader turned his glare on her. Stay out of this, lady. This is between me and the movie star. Eastwood stood, up slowly. At 6 feet 4 inches, he towered over the seated biker. The lady asked you to leave, he said, his voice still quiet but carrying an unmistakable steel now. I think you should listen. The biker leader shot to his feet, knocking his chair over backward. His friend stood too, forming a semicircle, around Eastwood. The leader jabbed a finger into Eastwood's chest. Who's gonna make us, you? He laughed, looking back at his friends for support. What are you gonna do, pull out your 6-shooter, make my day? He mimicked Eastwood's famous squint, drawing laughs from his crew. Eastwood didn't move, didn't flinch at the finger jabbing. His chest. He simply looked at the biker with those pale eyes that had stared down countless villains on screen. But there was something in those eyes now that hadn't been there before. A focus, a clarity, like a predator assessing its prey. Last chance, Eastwood said softly. Walk away. The bearded leader mistook Eastwood's calm for weakness, his restraint for fear. With a sneer, he grabbed the front of Eastwood's shirt with both hands, bunching the fabric in his fists. Or what? He growled, pulling Eastwood closer. What are you gonna do about it, tough guy? Time seemed to slow down. Dottie backed away, eyes wide. The cook hovered in the kitchen doorway, unsure whether to intervene. The other bikers tensed, ready for the fun to start. They expected to see their leader rough up the famous actor, maybe mess up that famous face a little, teach him a lesson about real toughness. What they didn't expect was what happened next. As the biker pulled him forward, Eastwood moved with the motion rather than against it. In one fluid movement, almost two, fast to follow. His hands came up between the biker's arms, breaking the grip on his shirt. Before anyone could react, Eastwood had the biker's wrist locked in a hold that looked gentle but caused immediate, excruciating pain. The biker leader's face registered shock, then disbelief, then pain. He dropped to one knee, a strangled sound escaping his throat. Eastwood held the wrist lock for just a second longer, then released him, stepping back smoothly into a balanced stance. The entire movement had taken less than 2 seconds. The diner fell silent. The biker leader knelt on the floor, cradling his wrist, looking up at Eastwood with a mixture of pain and confusion. His friends stood frozen, struggling to process what they had just witnessed. What the hell was that? The skinny biker with long hair finally asked, his voice breaking the silence. Eastwood straightened his shirt calmly. That, he said, was your cue to leave. The bearded leader stumbled back to his feet, his face flushed with a mixture of pain and embarrassment. He flexed his wrist, wincing slightly. The other bikers looked at each other, uncertain what to do next. This wasn't how things usually went for them. People backed down. People got scared. People certainly didn't flip the script like Eastwood just had. Lucky move, the leader muttered, trying to save face in front of his crew. But his eyes told a different story. There was a new wariness there, a reassessment happening behind that weathered face. Eastwood hadn't moved. He stood relaxed but ready, his hands loose at his sides. Nothing in his posture suggested aggression, but something had changed in the air around him. The bikers sensed it too. An invisible boundary had been drawn, and they'd just discovered the consequences of crossing it. The bald biker took a step forward, his fists clenched. That was a cheap shot, he growled. Let's see you try that again. Eastwood's gaze shifted to him, calm and measuring. I'd rather not, he said simply. From behind the counter, Dottie spoke up again, her voice steadier now. I'm calling the sheriff if you boys don't clear out right now. She had the diner's phone in her hand, her finger hovering over the buttons. The long-haired biker laughed nervously. Come on, lady, we're just having some fun. No need to get the law involved. Doesn't look like fun to me, she replied, nodding toward their leader who was still massaging his wrist. The bearded leader looked at Eastwood with narrowed eyes. What was that? Some kind of judo trick? Kyokushin karate, Eastwood replied, his voice matter of fact. Been studying it for years. This new information rippled through the group of bikers. They exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. The dynamic had shifted. What had started as 6 against 1 suddenly felt more evenly matched. The leader took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture that was half surrender, half preparation. Karate, huh? That explains a few things. But there's 6 of us, and 1 of you, movie star. Those ain't great odds, black belt or not. Eastwood didn't take the bait. I'm not looking to fight you boys. Like I said, I just came in for a quiet meal. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, placing them on the table to cover his check. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I'll be on my way. He made a move to step around the group, but the bald biker shifted to block his path. Not so fast, he said. We ain't done talking yet. Eastwood stopped, looking at the man with those pale, steady eyes. I think we are. The tension in the diner had reached a breaking point. The cook had disappeared into the back, presumably to find something more substantial than a spatula to use as a weapon if things got ugly. Dottie had the phone, receiver pressed to her ear now, though whether she was actually calling anyone was unclear. The bald biker made his move. He lunged forward, throwing a wild haymaker aimed at Eastwood's jaw. It was the kind of punch that would have ended the confrontation if it had landed. All power, no finesse. But it never came close. Eastwood slipped the punch with a subtle movement, almost as if he'd seen it coming before the biker had even decided to throw it. In the same fluid motion, he stepped to the side and used the biker's own momentum against him, guiding him past with a hand on his shoulder. The biker stumbled forward, off balance, and crashed into an empty table. Dale, you idiot, the leader muttered as his friend picked himself up, red-faced and now truly angry. Eastwood hadn't moved back into a fighting stance. He still stood as if this were a normal conversation, no tension visible in his body. But his eyes didn't leave the group, tracking their movements with practiced precision. Look, Eastwood said, his voice still calm. I don't want to hurt anyone, and I don't think any of you really want to get hurt. So why don't we call it a night? The long-haired biker laughed, but it was a hollow sound. You think you're gonna hurt us? Man, you've been playing tough guys too long. This ain't the movies. No, Eastwood agreed. It's not. In the movies, people get hit and bounce back up. Real fights don't work that way. There was no threat in his tone, just a statement of fact. Real fights end badly. often for everyone involved. The youngest of the bikers, who had been quiet until now, tugged at the leader's sleeve. "Come on, Ray. This ain't worth it. Let's just go." Ray, the bearded leader, hesitated. His pride was wounded, but he wasn't stupid. Something in Eastwood's demeanor had gotten through to him. The absolute certainty, the lack of bluster or bravado. This wasn't a man talking tough. This was a man who knew exactly what he was capable of and had nothing to prove. But Dale, the bald biker, wasn't ready to back down. His pride was hurt worse than his body after being tossed aside so easily. "You guys can leave if you want," he snarled. "I'm not letting some Hollywood phony make me look like a fool." Before anyone could stop him, Dale charged again, this time joined by the stocky biker who had first recognized Eastwood. They came at him from two sides, thinking to overwhelm him with numbers. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for everyone watching. Eastwood moved with a speed and precision that belied his years, flowing between the two attackers like water. He caught Dale's arm as the bald man swung again, using a simple joint lock to redirect him into the path of the stocky biker. The two collided awkwardly. As they tried to disentangle themselves, Eastwood applied pressure to Dale's wrist and elbow, guiding him down to one knee in a control hold that looked almost gentle but was clearly excruciating. The stocky biker regained his footing and lunged again. Eastwood, still controlling Dale with one hand, used his free arm to block the punch. Then, with a quick twist of his body, he swept the stocky biker's legs out from under him, sending him sprawling to the floor. The entire exchange had taken perhaps 3 seconds. "Jesus Christ," muttered the long-haired biker, backing away. "He's the real deal." Ray, watching his two friends neutralized so efficiently, made the wise decision to stand down. Okay, he said, raising his hands. "That's enough. Dale, back off before he breaks something." Dale, his face contorted in pain from the hold, didn't need much convincing. Eastwood released him immediately, stepping back to give the men space to recover. The stocky biker picked himself up off the floor, embarrassment written across his features. A strange quiet settled over the diner. The confrontation had reached its climax and passed, leaving an awkward vacuum in its wake. No one seemed to know what came next in this unexpected script. It was Eastwood who broke the silence. "You boys ride Harleys?" he asked, his tone conversational, as if the last few minutes hadn't happened. Ray blinked, thrown by the question. "Yeah, what about it?" "Nice bikes," Eastwood said with genuine appreciation. "I used to ride one myself back in the day. 55 Hydra Glide." This unexpected turn in the conversation seemed to diffuse the last of the tension. Ray's posture relaxed slightly. "No kidding? I wouldn't have pegged you for a rider." "There's a lot about me that might surprise you," Eastwood replied with the hint of a smile. Dottie, seeing that the crisis had passed, set the phone down and approached cautiously. "Everything okay over here?" "Just fine," Eastwood assured her. "In fact, I think I'll have another cup of coffee if that's all right, and maybe these gentlemen would like to join me." He looked at Ray with a raised eyebrow, an olive branch extended. Ray hesitated, looking at his friends. Dale was still rubbing his wrist, glaring at Eastwood, but the others seemed willing to let bygones be bygones. Pride was one thing, but continuing a fight they now knew they couldn't win was another matter entirely. "Yeah, all right," Ray said finally. "Coffee sounds good." Eastwood gestured to the booth he'd been sitting in. "Have a seat." The bikers exchanged glances, then shuffled over to join him. There was an awkward moment as they arranged themselves. Dale and the stocky biker choosing to sit at a neighboring table rather than directly with Eastwood, still nursing both injuries and bruised egos. Dottie brought a fresh pot of coffee and enough cups for everyone, shaking her head slightly at the strange turn of events. "You boys behave now," she warned, but there was relief in her voice. As she poured the coffee, Ray cleared his throat. "So karate, huh? Never would have guessed." Eastwood nodded, taking a sip from his cup. "Started training in the 60s. Found a good teacher in Oakland. It helps with the film work, balance, coordination, but mostly I do it for the discipline." "How long did it take?" asked the young biker who had wanted to leave earlier. To get the black belt, I mean. Years, Eastwood replied. It's not something you rush. The belt isn't really the point anyway. It's the journey getting there. The bikers nodded, some looking genuinely interested, others just relieved that the conversation had moved to safer ground. The cook reappeared from the kitchen, a baseball bat no longer needed, and returned to his grill. Outside, the neon sign continued to buzz, casting its blue glow over the parking lot where the motorcycles stood alongside Eastwood's pickup truck. Inside, over steaming cups of coffee, an unlikely group found common ground in the aftermath of conflict averted. The unexpected coffee break with the bikers took a surprisingly pleasant turn. As the minutes passed, the earlier tension melted away, replaced by a cautious curiosity on both sides. Ray, the bearded leader, seemed particularly interested in Eastwood's martial arts background. "So you're telling me you train every day?" Ray asked, leaning forward on his elbows. "Even when you're filming?" Eastwood nodded, warming his hands around his coffee cup. "Try to. Early mornings usually before heading to set. Helps clear my head." "And that move you did on Dale," Ray continued, gesturing toward his still sulking friend at the next table. "What was that exactly?" "Just a simple wrist lock," Eastwood explained. "It's about leverage, not strength. The human body has natural weak points. You apply pressure in the right place in the right direction, and size doesn't matter much." The young biker whistled, impressed. "Could you show me that?" Dale shot him a dirty look. "You volunteering to be the dummy, Bobby?" Bobby shrugged, undeterred. "Why not? It's not every day you get a lesson from Clint Eastwood." Eastwood considered the request. The situation had diffused considerably, and there seemed to be genuine interest rather than hostility now. "All right," he agreed, "but I'll demonstrate slowly, no pressure applied." Bobby got up and stood beside Eastwood's booth. The actor rose to his feet with fluid grace that belied his years, positioning himself at an angle to Bobby that allowed everyone to see. "Okay, so throw a straight punch, nice and slow," Eastwood instructed. Bobby played along, extending his arm in slow motion toward Eastwood's chest. Eastwood narrated as he moved, his hands demonstrating the technique without applying any real pressure. "As the punch comes in, I step slightly to the outside," he explained, shifting his weight. "My lead hand redirects the punch while my other hand catches the wrist. Then it's just a matter of rotating the wrist against its natural range of motion, using the attacker's own arm as a lever." He showed the movement in stages, turning Bobby's wrist just enough to demonstrate the principle without causing discomfort. The other bikers watched with rapt attention, even Dale and the stocky one, though they tried to appear uninterested. "The key," Eastwood continued, releasing Bobby's arm, "is not fighting force with force. That's what most people get wrong. They think martial arts is about being stronger or tougher than the other guy. It's not. It's about balance, timing, and using the other person's energy against them." Ray nodded thoughtfully. "Kind of like riding a bike through a sharp turn. You don't fight the momentum, you lean into it." Eastwood smiled slightly, the first genuine smile since the bikers had approached his table. "That's not a bad analogy." Bobby returned to his seat, looking at his wrist with newfound respect. "Where'd you learn all this anyway? Some fancy Hollywood dojo?" "Oakland, like I said," Eastwood replied. "Found a Japanese teacher there back in '63. Nothing fancy about the place. Just a converted warehouse with mats on the floor. Trained there for years before the guy moved back to Japan." "And the studio let you do all that?" the long-haired biker asked. "Figured they'd be worried about their star getting his face messed up." Eastwood shrugged. "They didn't much like it at first, but I've always done things my own way. Besides, it came in handy for the stunts." Dottie approached with the coffee pot again, refilling cups. The earlier wariness in her expression had softened as she watched the unlikely group find common ground. "Anyone hungry?" she asked. "Kitchen's still open for another hour." The mention of food seemed to break some invisible barrier. Soon plates of burgers, fries, and pie were being passed around as the conversation continued to flow more naturally. Eastwood ordered a slice of apple pie, listening more than talking as the bikers began to share stories of their own. Ray, it turned out, had been a mechanic in Vietnam, serving with the army before coming home and finding that civilian life didn't quite fit anymore. He'd found brotherhood on the road with his motorcycle club, traveling up and down the West Coast, picking up odd jobs when money ran low. Not that different from acting when you think about it, Ray mused. Both of us living job to job, always on the move. Eastwood nodded. More similarities than differences, probably, except for the millions of dollars and the fancy Hollywood mansions, Dale muttered, speaking up for the first time since joining the table. There was still an edge to his voice, but it lacked the earlier hostility. Eastwood met his gaze evenly. I grew up during the Depression. Father was a steelworker. Spent plenty of time on the wrong side of the tracks before I got lucky. Lucky, Bobby repeated. That what you call it? Luck and stubborn persistence, Eastwood clarified. And being in the right place at the right time. The stocky biker, who had introduced himself as Tony, leaned forward. Is it true what they say? About Hollywood being full of phonies and backstabbers? Eastwood considered this. Some of that, sure, just like any business. But there are good people, too. Hard, workers who care about the craft. He took a bite of pie, then added, the trick is figuring out who's who. As the evening wore on, the conversation drifted from Hollywood to motorcycles to music and back again. The initial confrontation seemed like a distant memory now, though. Dale occasionally rubbed his wrist, a reminder of how the night had nearly gone sideways. You know, Ray said eventually, my old lady's never gonna believe I had pie with Clint Eastwood. The long-haired biker Pete grinned. She's especially not gonna believe you tried to rough him up first. Hey now, Ray protested. I wasn't trying to rough anybody up, just having a friendly conversation that got a little intense. Laughter rippled around the table, even Eastwood cracking a smile. Got a camera in your truck? Bobby asked Eastwood. We could take a picture, prove it happened. Eastwood shook his head. No camera, but I've got something better. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pen, then took a napkin from the dispenser. How about an autograph for your old lady? He offered to Ray. The bearded biker looked momentarily taken aback, then nodded, a sheepish expression crossing his weathered face. Yeah, she'd like that. Her name's Louise. Eastwood wrote on the napkin, his handwriting neat and precise. To Louise. Sorry I had to teach Ray some manners. He's a good man. Best wishes, Clint Eastwood. He slid the napkin across the table. Ray read it and laughed, tucking it carefully into his vest pocket. She's gonna frame this, you know. Make sure you tell her the whole story, Eastwood said, including the part where you all bought me pie. This brought another round of laughter from the group. Outside, the night had deepened, stars visible now in the clear California sky. A few cars passed on the highway, headlights sweeping across the diner windows. In the small, warmly lit space, the unlikely gathering continued their conversation, finding unexpected connections. Dottie, watching from behind the counter, shook her head in amazement. Never thought I'd see the day, she murmured to the cook. As midnight approached, the bikers began to talk about hitting the road. They had a long ride ahead, planning to reach San Francisco by morning. What about you? Ray asked Eastwood. Where are you headed? Carmel, Eastwood replied. Got a house there, taking some time off before the next project starts. Carmel, huh? Ray nodded appreciatively. Nice town. Passed through there last summer. You boys ever ride through there again? Look me up, Eastwood said, surprising even. Himself with the invitation. I mean it. Ray studied him for a moment, then extended his hand across the table. Might just do that. Eastwood shook it firmly. One by one, the other bikers followed suit, even Dale eventually offering a grudging handshake. Only Tony held back, still nursing some resentment from earlier. Hey, before we go, Bobby said suddenly, would you mind showing me that other move? The one you did on Tony? That leg sweep thing? Tony scowled. It wasn't that impressive. Eastwood glanced at Tony, noting the lingering pride. Another time, maybe, he said diplomatically. It's getting late and you boys have a long ride ahead. The group gathered their things, leaving generous tips for Dottie despite their earlier rowdiness. As they headed for the door, Ray paused, turning back to Eastwood, who remained seated at the booth. You know, Ray said, I always figured guys like you were all talk. All that tough guy stuff was just for the cameras." He adjusted his leather vest, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Nice to be wrong sometimes." Eastwood nodded, accepting the compliment for what it was. "Ride safe." "Always do," Ray replied with a grin. Then he and his crew were out the door, the bell jingling behind them. Through the window, Eastwood watched as they mounted their motorcycles, engines roaring to life in the quiet night. Headlights cut through the darkness as they pulled out of the parking lot, a parade of chrome and leather disappearing down the highway. Dottie approached his table, coffee pot in hand. "More coffee, Mr. Eastwood?" He considered it, then shook his head. "No, thanks. I should be hitting the road, too." "On the house," she said, nodding toward his empty plate. "Least I can do after, well, everything." "I appreciate it," Eastwood said, rising from the booth, "but I'll pay my way." He placed enough bills on the table to cover his meal several times over. "You handled that real well," Dottie commented, gesturing toward the door where the bikers had exited. "Could have gone real bad." Eastwood nodded, reaching for his hat. Best fights are the ones you walk away from. Outside, the night air was cool and fresh, smelling of the nearby ocean. Eastwood stood for a moment beside his truck, looking up at the stars scattered across the vast California sky. In the distance, he could still hear the fading rumble of motorcycle engines. Eastwood climbed into his pickup truck and started the engine, the familiar rumble a comforting sound in the quiet night. As he pulled out of the diner parking lot, he found himself smiling slightly. The evening had certainly not gone as planned, but there was something satisfying about how it had turned out. Violence avoided, understanding reached. It was the kind of resolution rarely found in his films, where conflicts typically ended with gunfire rather than handshakes. He drove for about 20 minutes along the coastal highway, windows down to let in the cool ocean breeze. The road wound along cliffs that dropped away to the Pacific, moonlight silvering the water far below. His mind drifted back to the encounter, replaying the moments when he'd been forced to use his training. It had been years since he'd found himself in a real confrontation. Most people either recognized him and became instantly friendly, or they kept their distance out of respect or intimidation. These bikers had been different, unimpressed by his fame, looking for a target for their restless energy. It reminded him of his younger days before Hollywood, when he'd had to rely on his wits and sometimes his fists to get by. The headlights of his truck suddenly illuminated something on the roadside ahead, a motorcycle tilted at an odd angle, on the shoulder and a figure waving frantically. Eastwood slowed, caution mingling with recognition as he drew closer. It was Tony, the stocky biker who had held onto his resentment even as the others had warmed up. Eastwood pulled over, keeping the engine running as he rolled down his window. "Problem with your bike?" Tony's face showed surprise, then relief at seeing who had stopped. "Blew a tire," he explained, gesturing toward the rear wheel of his Harley. "Got separated from the others when it happened. They're probably miles ahead by now." Eastwood glanced at the motorcycle. The rear tire was indeed flat, the rubber shredded along one side. "Got a spare?" Tony shook his head. "Nah, and no cell reception out here to call for help." He hesitated, pride warring with practicality. "Look, I know we got off on the wrong foot back there, but any chance you could give me a lift to the next town? There's a garage that stays open late for bikers." Eastwood considered for a moment, then nodded. "We can do better than that. I've got tools in the back. Let's see if we can get you back on the road." Tony looked surprised. "You'd help me fix it? After what happened at the diner?" "Water under the bridge," Eastwood replied, shutting off the engine and stepping out of the truck. "Besides, I worked as a mechanic once before the acting gigs. Might as well put those skills to use." The two men stood in the glow of the truck's headlights, an unlikely pair on the deserted highway. Eastwood opened the toolbox he kept in the truck bed, pulling out a flashlight and basic tools. "Don't suppose you've got a motorcycle tire in there too?" Tony asked with a hint of humor. Eastwood shook his head. "No such luck, but we might be able to patch it enough to get you to that garage." They set to work, moving the motorcycle to a flatter section of the shoulder where they had more room. Tony held the flashlight while Eastwood examined the damage more closely. "Looks like you hit something sharp," Eastwood observed, pointing to a deep gash in the rubber. "Road debris, probably." Tony nodded. "Yeah, didn't see it until it was too late. Heard the pop and felt the bike start to wobble." "Lucky you kept it upright," Eastwood commented, already removing tools from his kit. "These old Harleys can be tricky, with a blowout." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds being the distant crash of waves against the cliffs below and the occasional passing car. It was strange how quickly hostility could turn to cooperation when circumstances changed. "Can I ask you something?" Tony said finally, breaking the silence. Eastwood glanced up from the tire he was working on. "Sure. Back at the diner when we were giving you a hard time. Why didn't you just throw your weight around? Tell us who you were, threaten to call. The cops or something?" Eastwood considered the question, hand still working methodically on the tire. "Wouldn't have solved anything," he replied. "Might have made things worse. Most famous people I've met, not that I've met many, they love reminding you who they are. Like being a big shot gives them the right to special treatment." Eastwood shrugged. "Never saw much point in that. Person either respects you for who you are, or they don't. A name doesn't change that." Tony digested this, holding the flashlight steady. "And the karate stuff, why keep that quiet? Seems like something you'd want people to know about." "It's not for show," Eastwood explained, voice matter of fact. "Never has been. I train for myself, not for anyone else. But it could help your image, right? The tough guy thing?" Eastwood smiled slightly. "I don't need help with that. Movies take care of it just fine." They lapsed into silence again as Eastwood continued working on the tire. There was something peaceful about the mechanical task, the focus it required pushing away all other concerns. The night air was cool and salty from the ocean, the sky above them scattered with stars untainted by city lights. "There," Eastwood said finally, sitting back on his heels. "It's not pretty, but it should hold until you reach town." Tony inspected the patched tire with grudging admiration. "Not bad for a movie star." "Like I said, I wasn't always in the movies." Eastwood stood, wiping his hands on a rag from his toolkit. "When I first came to Hollywood, I was digging swimming pools to make ends meet." This seemed to surprise Tony. "No kidding? Hard to picture." "Everyone starts somewhere," Eastwood said, packing away his tools. "Fame doesn't fall in your lap." Tony nodded thoughtfully, then extended his hand. "Hey, I appreciate this, and sorry about before. At the diner." Eastwood shook the offered hand firmly. "Forgotten. Ray was right about you," Tony admitted. "You're all right." They tested the patched tire, making sure it held air and could support weight. It wasn't perfect, but it would get Tony to the garage in the next town. "Take it slow," Eastwood advised. "No sharp turns." Tony nodded, swinging his leg over the motorcycle seat. "Your buddies at the studio know about this side of you? The mechanic, who knows karate and helps out strangers on the highway?" Eastwood smiled, a genuine one this time. "They know what I let them know." "Well, your secret's safe with me," Tony promised, kick-starting the motorcycle. The engine roared to life, echoing against the cliff face, though I might have to brag a little about getting a personal repair job from Clint Eastwood. "Just don't mention the part where you tried to punch me first," Eastwood replied dryly. Tony laughed. "Deal." He revved the engine once, then added, "Ray wasn't kidding about looking you up if we ride through Carmel again." "Doors open," Eastwood assured him. "Just call ahead, and bring better manners next time." With a final nod of thanks, Tony guided his motorcycle back onto the highway, moving carefully with the patched tire. Eastwood watched until the red taillight disappeared around a bend, then returned to his truck. As he continued his drive toward Carmel, Eastwood reflected on the strange turns the evening had taken. What had started as a quiet dinner had transformed into a confrontation, then an unexpected connection, and finally an act of roadside assistance. Life had a way of surprising you like that, throwing challenges in your path when you least expected them. It reminded him of something his old karate teacher had once told him. The true test of a martial artist isn't how he performs in the dojo, but how he lives his principles in the world. Tonight had been such a test, and Eastwood felt a quiet satisfaction in how it had played out. The coastal highway stretched before him, moonlight gleaming on the asphalt. In a few hours he'd be home in Carmel, this incident becoming just another story in a life already filled with them. But it was these unexpected moments, these unscripted encounters, that often proved more meaningful than the carefully choreographed scenes of his film career. A week later, a small package arrived at Eastwood's Carmel home. Inside was a framed photograph showing Eastwood standing with Ray, Bobby, Pete, Dale, and Tony outside Pete's roadside diner. Everyone was smiling, even Dale, though his was more of a grimace. A note accompanied the photo. "Thanks for the coffee, the karate lesson, and the tire patch. Not bad for a Hollywood tough guy. Your friends from the road." Eastwood chuckled, placing the photo on a shelf in his study alongside awards and memorabilia from his films. Somehow this unlikely souvenir seemed to belong there, a reminder that real life often wrote the best scripts. Years later, long after the incident had faded from memory, Eastwood would incorporate elements of that night into a film character, not the confrontation itself but the philosophy behind his response. The quiet strength, the reluctance to fight coupled with the ability to end things quickly when necessary, the preference for resolution over conflict. These became hallmarks of his later roles, adding depth to the tough guy persona that had made him famous. And occasionally, when passing a roadside diner or hearing the rumble of motorcycles, Eastwood would find himself thinking of that night, of frightened bikers who became unexpected friends, of violence avoided through skill and restraint, and of the simple truth he'd learned early in his martial arts training, that the greatest victory often comes not from defeating an opponent, but from transforming an enemy into a friend.